My name is Kable Thurlow, and I'm an MSU Extension beef and grazing educator, and I'm here today on the Baseline Farm with farmer John Cox, and we're going to talk a little bit about grazing management today. There's three things really that I think about when it comes to grazing management, and that's the grazing system that you choose, whether it's a continuous system or whether it's a rotational system. And we could talk for days about the benefits of, in my opinion, rotational grazing. The other thing that we like to talk about and that's critical is the watering system. So we'll have John talk a little bit about the watering system that he's got here today. And we also want to talk about fencing, and we have some fencing material, portable fencing material here in front of us today, just to give you an example of what it is that we're talking about. So John, we're out here in the pasture. You moved these cattle a little while ago. You were setting up temporary fence using this poly wire here in front of us and these step-in posts that you've got in front of you. Can you tell us a little bit about how you determine what size of paddock you use for these cattle?
Yeah.
So kind of how you allocate pasture?
It's a learning process for sure. And you know, it started out when I got started 4 or 5 years ago, kind of academically. Like, you can look at your grazing stick or take an estimate of how much forage you've got per acre, tons per acre, and look at your herd size and how much, you know, they're going to eat based on how big your animals are. And then you kind of just pace off a distance. Say you need an acre or an acre and a half. You know, you go 209 feet and then 209 feet, and then there's an acre, square acre.
And that, John, that's the science part of it that we like to say, right?
That's the idea, and I did do that a few times, but in general, you just get a feel for it. You look at how much grass you think you have, and you know how many cattle you have, and you set up an area and then see how they do. These days, I'll move at least once a day, but more often 2, even 3 times a day. And when I say move, that means give them some new area. You don't need to totally move from one spot to another and set up a back fence to keep them out of the old area. They'll stay out of there on their own if they've got good stuff ahead of them. So it comes with a feel for it, and you just watch their performance as well.
You've mentioned a couple of key things, and one of the things that I also encourage producers to think about when they're doing rotational grazing is you know, coming back and evaluating those cattle after you've made those moves. Yeah, you use all the tools that you have available to determine A, how much forage you have in a location, and B, you know how many animals you have, and you have to have an idea of the weight of those animals, and from those two knowns we can estimate how much forage they're going to use, and that's how you determine your paddock size. And then you come back that next day and evaluate, which is the art part of it. Did I give them enough, or are they standing up and running to the gate when I come there, and are they looking for more, or are they laying down chewing their cuds? So those are some of the simple things that we use to determine whether we're giving them enough pasture. You've got to know the amount of forage that you have available and the approximate live weight of the animals that you have that you're moving, and then you move them. You mentioned something critical. When you're moving 2 or 3 times a day, okay, one of the reasons that we want to do rotational grazing over continuous grazing is to increase the efficiency of the harvest. That system will allow you to go from, in a continuous system, 30 to 40% grazing efficiency, to management intensive system like you're talking about here today, upwards of 70% and greater. So that's one of the huge advantages of using rotational grazing over a continuous grazing system. And the back fence isn't needed when you're moving that often, because it takes several days before that plant starts to regrow. Mm-hmm. You want to have them off there in 3 or 4 days, but if it's just a day or two, you don't need the back fence. You're absolutely right there, because that regrowth doesn't start until 3 or 4 days after you've moved them animals off there. And again, rest and recovery are huge with rotational grazing. Alan Williams probably says it best, but you're in an area like this, you graze it, and then you get off and you let it recover and then you can come back and graze it again, and that's where you get that efficiency. So can you tell us a little bit about the fencing that you use here? I've got a post.
Yep.
And you tell us a little bit about that fencing.
Yeah, I've learned a lot by doing it a lot. For the actual fence, you need an electric wire. I do. So this is poly wire, they call it. It's poly plastic twine or braided rope. There's metal filaments in there that are conductive, stainless steel and sometimes copper, and you energize this through some type of energizer. It could be battery powered, solar battery powered, could be plugged into the wall. Lots of options there, as long as you have one that's powerful enough with a good enough grounding system. I've had pretty good luck with it. This reel has a gearing mechanism, so when you rotate the handle, you'll get 3 rotations of the bobbin, and that's important because you're going to be reeling this up and unreeling it quite a bit, but reeling it all back up eventually. And with a non-geared reel, you really have to spin that thing to get it to reel back up.
If you've ever used both, you'll appreciate the geared reel, won't you? Yeah,
this stuff's not cheap. You can probably have to order it online, because I don't know of any local stores that have it. There might be a few, but you're looking at more than $100 for a wire and a reel, but it's worth it, let me tell you. So you've got multiple reels perhaps, and you have a lot of versatility with this type of system. You can make any shape you want to, just about.
A question that I get frequently, John, is will this small, can you run that back out again? Will this small wire really keep cattle in?
And
can you speak to that?
So when I first got here, I had been using this system, and the old guy was moving off, had already sold his cattle, and he saw what I set up with this type of wire, and he said, that wire will never hold those cattle. And sure enough, it did.
Yes.
And I didn't have to invent it. Other people have proven that time and time again. You'd have to train them to it, that's for sure. If you just set this up with cattle, had never seen it, they would go under it, they'd go through it, they'd knock it down. There's not much to hold it together when you have these posts that just step into the ground. But once they learn to respect it, they're very respectful, and it doesn't even need to be energized every second of the day in order for them to stay in.
It does an amazing job of containing them, and well, that's what we're out here in the pasture right now, and that's what they're contained with here in this paddock that we're in right now. So we've talked about your type of grazing management. You're moving 2 or 3 times a day. That's definitely a management intensive rotational grazing system. You've covered your fencing that you use, and these step-in posts are extremely simple to use. You can put them just about anywhere, and you hook your wire in here, and you can walk off across this field and set up your paddock. The other thing that we need to mention, and you talked about this in your introduction, is the watering system. Can you talk to the watering system that you have here?
Yeah, it's important to have the water pretty close to the cattle, and by pretty close, I think the number might be 800 feet that they would have to walk to a water source. See, the difference is if they've got to walk a long way, they'll go as a herd, perhaps. They'll decide that, okay, it's time to get water. Everybody goes to get water. And that makes grazing a little more difficult, because then you've got to have a pretty good water source. If you've got a large number of cattle drinking out of one water source, it's got to have a pretty good flow rate, recharge rate. And that might be more than your well pump could deliver. I like using well water here because we've got pretty good water, and the pump might only be 10 gallons per minute, but by running a pipeline on top of the ground with poly pipe, I found it to work pretty well. We get water out to just about everywhere, and I use portable water troughs, 100-gallon size, maybe a little larger, with a float valve, so they stay full. Once you connect them up, you don't have to stand there and watch it.
So John, is this the tank that these cattle are watering out of now, down over the hill there?
Exactly. So you
can't see the water line that's along that fence, but it's an above ground plastic water line that feeds that tank. Yeah. And that's the float that John's talking about. His 800 number is exactly right, and that if you look at research that Jim Garish did when he was at the University of Missouri, he showed exactly what John has already said here, that if you have that water in that 600 to 800 foot distance from the herd, they will go 2 or 3 at a time, and they can access that 100-gallon water tank and be fine. If they were going a half a mile, you would need a tank way bigger than that to be able to get everybody a drink, because what typically happens is the boss cows in your bull will get their drink and then they'll leave, and the young stock, they're herd animals, so the young stock, they don't get a chance to drink and they take off without having a drink, and that affects animal performance. So that's another thing that you want to look at. But yeah, you described the watering system to a T.